Yogah Karmasu Kaushalam.
In this video, we are going to talk about the spiritual moral dimensions of teachers' classroom language policies. Political, empirical and pedagogical efforts to equitably educate language minority students have not successfully curbed the anti-immigrant and anti-indigenous minority education trend that persists. Goodlad asks a very pertinent question. To what lengths should teachers go to reach the diversity of students in their class? The complexities involved in equitably educating language minority students exceeds a strictly political or pedagogical level of policy making. These complexities raise ethical issues and involve the moral dimensions of teaching in a diverse democracy. However, policymakers, administrators and teachers rarely consider the moral dimensions involved in a classroom where English is taught as a second language. Rather, policymakers and educators usually remain focused on the technical aspects of education and programmatic debates about teaching English as a second language. There needs to be a distinction between a secular and a spiritual morality in the language classroom. The influence of teachers' beliefs on their individual classroom language policies is a huge factor while dealing with the moral dimension of the language classroom. Bull, Fruling and Chatterjee define ethical issues in multicultural and bilingual education as considerations of what people should do. These are ethical, not factual questions. They ask what people should do from among the actions that the facts make possible, what responsibilities people have towards one another, what freedom they should exercise, how they should make decisions that affect themselves and others, what role tradition should have in people's lives. They demonstrate that the ideal of unity in diversity has a moral and not just a pragmatic meaning. The moral dimensions of teaching English as a second language involve relationships between diverse people in a public education setting that is guided by a set of associated principles of equity. Principles of equity stress fair and appropriate treatment of all people. Equity, therefore, differs from equality as its focus exceeds creating simple parity. This definition prepares teachers to explore the construct of a secular morality. In other words, it is a secular morality motivated by utilitarian goals of a fair, well-functioning society. It is such social and economic interdependency that can motivate all educational stakeholders, which includes students, teachers, administrators, family and community members, to recognize and accept their moral responsibility towards educating language minority students. Contemporary educators, like their predecessors at the beginning of the century, turned to the secular moral dimensions of teaching in efforts to improve learning and social conditions. The schooling and social conditions they confront include today's inequitable distribution of wealth and disparate access to knowledge and education. Contemporary secular moral approaches to urban and multicultural education are grounded in the secular morals of equity and social justice, and the belief that improving language learning will contribute to improving society. These approaches emphasize the socio-political components of linguistic, cultural, and socio-economic difference, consider diversity a resource, and advocate examining and critiquing personal and institutionalized racism as a means of improving society and language learning. Contemporary conceptions of the secular moral dimensions of language teaching in today's diverse society manifest themselves in different models of political morality. Critical pedagogy offers its own version of a political morality. Critical pedagogists call for rigorous intellectual engagement with the issues of politics, oppression, and social justice. They summon teachers to identify the presence and implications of the historical, cultural, economic, and political factors that underlie their own beliefs, attitudes, and pedagogy, and seek to radically transform society along more equitable lines. However, a teacher must ask whether an intellectual commitment to the process is enough to sustain people through the messy and often painful course of establishing equitable language learning and social conditions for all people. Working for the equitable education of language minority students means contending with the strong tides of politics and emotions surrounding anti-immigrant and anti-minority educational mindsets. A secular moral commitment based on social and economic interdependency, or based on an intellectual commitment to a political morality, does not adequately motivate and sustain people. A spiritual morality offers another approach to language policy, promoting equitable public education in a diverse democracy. Language policy creation and implementation does not occur in a vacuum. Factors from various levels, central, state, district, classrooms, influence teachers' individual classroom policies regarding language diversity and interactions with language minority students. One crucial influence on teachers' individual policies and interactions is his or her own beliefs about language diversity and language minority students. Teacher credentialing agencies and researchers have begun to acknowledge the influence of teachers' beliefs and assumptions about language minority students on their interaction with them. Teachers' individual classroom language policy decisions occur in the context of presiding external policies. Their individual classroom policy decisions are also influenced by their own beliefs and assumptions regarding language minority students, how second languages and content are learned, and the role of public education in a diverse democracy. Jagdish and Weed describe teachers' individual language policy decisions as follows. Teachers have a significant influence over the daily life of students in their classrooms. They can actively create a climate of warmth and acceptance for language minority children, supporting the home language while fostering the growth of a second language. Conversely, they can allow policies of the school or classroom to benefit only the language majority students by accepting the exclusive use of the dominant language and permitting majority language students to gain through the social and cultural reward system at the expense of those students who speak minority languages. Now, this day-to-day influence and reaction of teachers amounts to a language policy. Jagdish and Weed show how teachers' language policy decisions at the classroom level involve both the influence of their individual beliefs about language minority students and related issues, and their reactions to external policy guidelines and mandates. Within their discussion of the role of teachers in language planning and policy, the Azrico and we describe another important characteristic of teachers' individual classroom policy decisions. First, they acknowledge that language policy decisions occur both formally and informally, and they state that the central idea of language planning is that actions and decisions are deliberate. This type of deliberate decision making relates to the type of professional behavior that scholars assert must characterize teachers' practice. These scholars contend that in addition to making professional decisions deliberately, teachers must base their decisions on current knowledge bases and recognize the influence of their own beliefs and assumptions. The deliberateness with which teachers make classroom decisions corresponds to their ability to identify and articulate the knowledge base and beliefs that inform their decisions. However, most teachers are not able nor are they educated to perform the metacognitive tasks of identifying and articulating the rationales behind these classroom practices. Teachers who do not identify their fundamental beliefs about language minority students, how language and content are learned, and their role in public schooling in a diverse democracy, often participate in standard language teaching practices without examining them. In other words, teachers who do not examine their own beliefs often take language teaching practices for granted and do not question their origins, but rather just accept their appropriateness without much question. In this unquestioning mode, practices such as tracking, segregation, and over-identification of language minority students to special education programs becomes the acceptable and appropriate norm. In addition to evading the moral dimensions of teaching, teachers whose beliefs remain unexamined also leave themselves subject to forces they may or may not agree with. The first of these forces is their own unexamined beliefs and assumptions about language minority students. The majority of teachers sincerely care about the students under their guidance and want to do the best things for them. However, many teachers are unfamiliar with language minority students and their needs and strengths. This lack of knowledge about language minority students and how best to teach them frustrates teachers and usually leads to either of two conclusions. First, the teacher concludes that he or she is an inadequate teacher, or second, the teacher concludes that there is something wrong with the language minority students which is beyond a regular teacher's capabilities to deal with. Now, the first conclusion may motivate the teacher to seek additional education, or it may result in anger towards language minority students. The second conclusion promises language minority students access to content knowledge and language development by assuming that these students enter schools with significant deficits, preventing their learning. Both conclusions detrimentally affect students and teachers on affective, social and cognitive levels, and inevitably impact classroom language policies. If teachers were to examine their own beliefs about language minority students and how language and content are learned, and then were to gather information on these topics, they would probably not reach the same conclusions. Teachers who do not examine their fundamental beliefs about language minority students and who do not acquire information about educating them also leave themselves open to forces of ever-changing external policies. Teachers whose fundamental beliefs about the minority students and the teaching of language remain unexamined may find themselves scrambling to meet the demands of whatever policy currently reigns. Now, in this condition, teachers are either tossed to and fro in a sea of changing politics and policies, or they become frustrated and proceed with whatever classroom language policy and practice they have always used and consider policy mandates and research as fickle, unfounded intrusions. In either cases, teachers are not encouraged to morally deliberate about their decisions regarding their classroom policies and practices with the language minority students. I hope that this discussion and the points that I raised will be significant pointers in your teaching approach. I wish all of you out there a great time in the classroom. Thank you.
I would like to thank for your scholarly talk and your scholarly ideas on language and society. This is one of very important aspect where we need to concentrate on. Society or language, they don't exist isolatedly.
Right.
So they are together, and together only we have to live, and together only we have to make our skills sharpen.
Right.
So this is a very interesting idea which you have talked about,
Yes,
and I
sir.
guess this will be very useful to our participants, to our teachers, and eventually to the students to make their life in society more impressive, more lively, and more successful. And this will help all of us to make our teaching and learning more effective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.